Hi, thank you for tuning in today. My name's Seth Gerson. I'm Program Director for K-12 Education at the National Governors Association. And today I have the honor of interviewing Dr. Constance Lindsay, Assistant Professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill School of Education, on the impact of high-quality principals on students, teachers, and schools. Please note that this recording is the latest in a series of 11 other NGA webinars and podcasts on school leadership hot topics, including conversations with the American Institutes of Research, Education Commission of the States, New Leaders, the Learning Policy Institute, nationally recognized school leadership experts, Dr. Paul Manna, Dr. Steve Tozer, and Dr. Jackie Wilson, as well as governors' policy advisors and state education chiefs from Delaware, Louisiana, and Tennessee. You can find these webinars and podcasts at nga.org. These podcasts are supported by and in partnership with the Wallace Foundation. The Wallace Foundation works to support principal and school leader preparation, development, and support across the country. Their Wallace Knowledge Center has multiple resources, tools, and reports on state strategies for school leadership, including Dr. Lindsay's most recent report on principal impact. You can find these resources at wallacefoundation.org or through a direct link on the NGA website. With that, let's dive into the conversation with Dr. Lindsay. Dr. Lindsay, welcome. It's great to have you with us today. Before we go right into specific questions, if you could just tell us a little bit about your background and how you've come to focus on school leadership.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me. I'm super excited to be here today. So I'm an assistant professor in the education policy and organizational leadership area of the School of Education. And so sort of broadly speaking, my research focuses on policies and practices with an eye towards closing racialized achievement gaps in education. And more recently, a lot of that work has really focused on human capital, and in particular, the ways in which teachers, and in particular teachers of color, can impact students of color or generate positive outcomes for them. And so as an extension of that work, I've become more interested in leadership. And that's what sort of led me into this particular project, thinking about how leaders might enact or hinder or sustain racialized achievement gaps, the positive ways they can intervene in school culture, in things like teacher hiring. There's a number of ways that leaders can impact these persistent and stubborn gaps that we have so many concerns about. And so that's how I arrived at this work.
Thanks, Dr. Lindsay. And you mentioned the positive aspects of the positive ways that principals can impact. So can you talk a little more about the research around how principals impact students, teachers, and schools, why governors themselves should really turn their attention to focusing on principal development and support?
Okay, awesome. So perhaps I should start with a background of the most recent report that we put out. So in February 2021, with funding and support from the Wallace Foundation, we actually conducted a synthesis of the past 20 years of research on principals, thinking about sort of the levers they can pull, how the principal workforce has changed over these past 20 years, and taking advantage of the fact that sort of the research has grown by leaps and bounds, and we're able to do lots of things in order to sort of estimate principal effects the same way that we estimate teacher effects. And so basically what we do in this report is a few things. So one, we take a look at the demographics of the principal workforce in terms of how things have changed by gender, how they've changed by race, age, experience, how principals are distributed. And then we sort of do two separate things. So one, we wanted to look at the studies that are able to look at principal effects. So when we say effects, the same way we think about teacher effects, we wanted to sort of do something analogous for principals. So there's about 6 studies out there that actually look and see, how much principals are able to grow students on standardized tests. And so we find that the effects are comparable, if not a little bit larger than for teachers. And so we thought that was super important because we have all of this research now on teacher effects. And then sort of in the remaining parts of the report, we use about 200 studies that we sort of coded and analyzed to identify leadership skills and behaviors that produce positive outcomes for students.
Thanks, Dr. Lindsay. And I think that's great for showing the student impact, not just and how it's larger than even teachers, which sometimes get the bulk of the focus, but really making the case to think about them in tandem and how do you raise not only teacher impact, but also principal impact. And you mentioned the new report or recent report, How Principals Affect Students in Schools, a systematic synthesis of 2 decades of research, which was an update to a 2004 report. Can you talk a little bit, that's a lot of time in between reports, how have you seen sort of the principal role evolve during that time, and what surprised you most even, between the 2 reports, what had changed the most between the 2?
That's a great question. So one, we first sort of start off by talking about the ways in which the policy context has changed in very important ways that impact the work of principals. So first, we talk about the rise of high stakes accountability systems, and increased focus on engagement with instruction, and then state and district investment in multiple measure educator evaluation systems, and then of course sort of this heightened attention to equity and outcomes for diverse students. And so sort of given that background, we then sort of ask questions like, what's happening to principal experience? So for example, we find that principal experience has actually been going down over time. And it's been especially sort of marked at high needs and hard to staff schools, right? And so we find lots of interesting things like that sort of would lead to many more interesting questions like, well, where are the principals going, right? If they're not staying in their buildings. And so we find that principals' experience or tenure is going down both sort of at a particular school and then sort of within the sort of in their time as principals, that's going down. We found that we pretty much have more women principals. The principalship has grown more female over time. So you sort of have these interesting sort of demographic trends. So we do find that while diversity has increased, it has failed to keep up with the representation of the public school student body, right? Which isn't super surprising because we know that there are some challenges around the teacher pipeline. And so you would expect to see that sort of at the principal level. So there's lots of interesting things that we sort of identify in terms of, who principals are in addition to sort of what they're doing.
Thank you. So looking at the numbers, you're definitely seeing some different trends, some on the positive side and some on the negative side. And it's always good to look at those numbers. In terms of the key behaviors and skills that you identified in the report that are most critical for principals impacting schools and teachers and students, can you talk a little bit more about that? And you've mentioned equity a few times, how that can be embedded as you're looking at which principals to hire, how to retain a diverse high quality workforce.
Okay, so I'll start off with the skills and behaviors. So we basically sort of from the diverse body of quantitative and qualitative literature, there are about 219 studies that sort of made it through our process where we identified 3 foundational skills that school leaders need to be successful. So those were people, instruction, and the organization. So not necessarily an exhaustive list, but most clearly supported by the weight of evidence. And oftentimes those skills are overlapping. And so what we found sort of in our review of the literature is that these skills manifest themselves in a set of leadership behaviors that the best available research suggests leads to positive outcomes. And so those behaviors, so sort of skill 1 is thinking about instructionally focused interactions with teachers. So this is forms of engagement with teachers that center on instructional practice, teacher evaluation, and the establishment of a data-driven school-wide instructional program. We also found a really important skill is building a productive school climate. So this is practices that encourage a school environment marked by trust, efficacy, teamwork, organizational learning, et cetera. Third skill is facilitating productive collaboration and professional learning communities. So these are strategies that promote teachers working together authentically with systems of support to improve their practice and enhance student learning. And then sort of fourth skill are, just the management skills needed for running any complex organization. So this includes the strategic staffing and strategic allocation of other resources. So as an example of this, you can think about principals managing time, which is a really scarce resource, but the better principals are going to be able to sort of manage time very well. And so basically what we observe across all the studies is that the principals who engage in those 4 leadership behaviors / skills see more positive outcomes in their schools and amongst their students. And, of course, a local context is always important in consideration of all of these things. But this is just sort of where the weight of the evidence landed. So if folks have the opportunity to download the report, there's actually a really nice graphic that sort of lays all of this out and sort of shows this relationship between the behaviors and the skills and producing these outcomes. But we also thought it was pretty important to note that sort of as a part of the regular business of the principal's work, principals also have to approach all of this with an equity lens. And so the synthesis has a separate section where we highlight how principals can have impacts on key student populations, including students of color, low-income students, students with special education needs, and English learners. And so the channels for those leader behaviors are both sort of indirect and direct, right? So for example, a direct channel might be pursuing equity in student discipline, while indirect channels might be working with teachers to implement culturally responsive pedagogy. And so the evidence suggests that approaching leadership work with this equity lens can promote more equitable student outcomes.
Thanks, Dr. Lindsay, very helpful. And just to connect to a previous webinar we had just a few weeks ago, Dr. Paul Manna was on, and a couple of things you said reminded me of what he had also mentioned, and echoes certainly his findings around, that people talk about sort of the principal going from a building manager to an instructional leader, but that it's not that it's changed, but that they're doing both in many ways, and that it's that they've added on top of one another. And then when you talked about being that instructional leader and the collaboration with your peers and other educators, talking about the principal as sort of this force multiplier and the impact that they're having, not only on students, but other teachers in the building, and that being part of the role. So I really appreciate your insights there. I want to just take a few moments and, we've been with COVID here, unfortunately, for 20 months or so. How have you seen the pandemic change because of change principals' role during the pandemic, amplifies sort of that need for a diverse, high quality pipeline of principals, and has it changed even your sense of those key behaviors or skills, or stayed the same?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, as with many things sort of in society, I think what COVID has done is just sort of amplified the need or exacerbated the need really for everything, or exacerbated gaps, however you want to think about it. And so to the extent that all of these things were super important for a well-functioning school before, now they take on even more importance. In particular, I think one of the challenges that I sort of saw last summer in particular, so I guess summer 2020, was people were sort of grappling both with thinking about school reopening and staffing, but also grappling with a lot of the challenges around equity. And so therefore thinking about sort of this equity lens is super important, and providing both teachers and principals with good skills around sort of thinking about how equity plays out in the classroom, right? Instead of just allowing people to sort of fly blind. So I think that's one major thing. I think also thinking about the principal as manager of scarce resources, and thinking about hiring in facing shortages, facing things like time away from school. So I think principals have to be extremely strategic in how they're deploying resources right now. And so I actually think what will be interesting to see is sort of where we are now and where we end up next fall. Um, because we've sort of, in many places, we've had a full year back open, or we've been back since August. And so it'll be curious to see how people have sort of updated their knowledge and identified, strategies and ways to, I don't want to use the word cope, but basically to cope with all the challenges that we have going on right now.
Thank you. And I think you're providing then a really good lens on the last 20 months and how that's changed. As we look ahead, one of the big changes just in the last number of months has been this large, unprecedented investment from the federal level in trying to address challenges from the pandemic, especially in education. How can you see sort of leveraging those dollars as part of that unprecedented federal funding to provide more high quality school leadership in states and districts?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think in a few ways. So first, really focusing on teachers and supporting teachers and human capital and giving them the resources to sort of do the work that they're trying to do, and really bolstering teachers in that way. I've also seen some really interesting research coming out about how to use these dollars, or to leverage these dollars the best in terms of addressing learning loss and learning gaps. And I've seen a lot of work on tutoring, and investing in tutoring, and also mentors. So I think a lot of it really is going to revolve around human capital and thinking about ways to sort of strengthen the workforce we have, but then also to augment it to assist with things like learning loss. And so I think there's a tremendous opportunity to really invest in the people first, and then maybe think about things like physical spaces sort of second. But I think people and human capital, and really the principal operating as the manager of a team, is what we should really focus on with those dollars.
That's great. And, something that seems very sustainable then, because once you have the professional learning for teachers and principals, it stays with them to be able to develop that relationships with students and parents and families, and to have those skills and attributes, many of which you've talked about on this webinar. Once you build up that skills and knowledge, it's there and it stays with for the duration of that teacher's career. In terms of a question we get a lot is just, who's doing this well? Where have you seen some of the bright spots across the country in states, districts, schools, that, if a governor wanted to elevate some of that work or use a model where they could see work that they can go forward on in a state or a district, where would you point to?
Oh, that's a great question. So I think I've seen exciting sort of flashes in lots of different places. So for example, in thinking about building teacher pipelines, especially when we're sort of dealing with both this challenge of sort of shortages and then shortages of teacher of color, there's some really interesting work out of Rhode Island where they are training and investing in paraprofessionals who tend to be a little bit more diverse, and have also expressed an interest in the classroom, but might not have the credentials to serve as full K-12 teachers. And so they're experimenting with investing in those teachers to build a pipeline. I think there's a few districts under the auspices of the Wallace Foundation that are really focusing on equity-focused pipelines for principals, and sort of thinking about that from the stage of teacher candidate all the way up through sort of principal assigned to a classroom, and how to use everything that we know about developing principals, but also to seriously infuse it with the equity lens. And so thinking about, all the skills and behaviors, all the different frameworks we've had over time that, where folks have developed these training programs, but really thinking about how to very smartly infuse equity into those pipelines. And I think there's several of those happening around the country right now. I don't know the districts off the top of my head. So I think there's certainly bright spots in many places where folks are really tackling a lot of these issues Yeah, so I think there's different places. I'm hesitant to call out particular districts.
That's great, and I'm so glad you mentioned the new Wallace initiative, and we'll be sure in the attachment to this webinar not only to include your report on principal impact, but also some of the relevant Wallace Foundation resources, including their new equity initiative that I know everyone's very excited about, including us. In terms of just taking just a step back for the last couple of questions, if a governor was interested in moving work forward in this area, what would be the number one advice you would give them prior to getting started if they were looking to build a diverse, high quality workforce in their states? Where would they begin?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I would focus on I'd focus in a couple of places. So one, teacher prep, and thinking about ways to invest in teacher prep so that one, it's more attractive for sort of all students, but also bringing in students of color into sort of the earlier teacher prep programs, because that's sort of the beginning of this human capital pipeline that will lead us to have a more diverse workforce in the future. And in particular, putting resources into entities that already produce teacher candidates of color. So the nation's minority serving institutions, the historically Black colleges, the Native serving institutions, the Hispanic serving institutions, they produce sort of more than their fair share of teachers of color. And so partnering with them for things like teaching fellows programs, which is something we have here in North Carolina, where there's resources at different sites. And so one of those sites, or one or two of those sites this year is an HBCU, and that's sponsored by our governor. So I think really focusing on that pipeline and expanding it, instead of sort of just trying to work with, or just trying to, instead of moving sort of the workforce we have around from school to school, we really want to broaden things and expand things and reach things back. So I would focus there. I would also sort of think about how existing principal training, certification, preparation works, and the ways that that might be updated, given sort of how the student body has changed, how the needs of a principal has changed, and how folks are maybe things just look different when folks are less likely to stay for very long periods of time, right? So, encourage folks to get the training, go to high needs, hard to staff schools, and give them the resources and support to make it worth their while to stay. So I think there's lots of opportunities for governors and state departments of education to really sort of, I guess, expand things and expand and update, I guess is what I would say.
Thanks, Dr. Lindsay. And it makes me think of two resources we'll be sure to include with this webinar. Number one, you mentioned Governor Cooper's efforts on educator diversity, that great task force that they were able to put together a couple of years ago, and the recommendations that came out of that for taking action. And we'll definitely want to include that as a good template for how to do this work and how to bring stakeholders around the table to move it forward. And then you mentioned the HBCUs, the MSIs, and so really thinking about the branch alliance and for educator diversity and the efforts that they have underway there to really create that pipeline out of, as you said, those schools to make sure you're recruiting from the very beginning a diverse, high quality pipeline. So just one last question. Where do you see your work? We've talked about the report you've already put out. Where do you see your work heading next? What are you most excited about? Optimism to end the call in challenging times.
Yeah. So I think in terms of optimism, I actually think at the state level, people are doing lots of work around building a high quality, diverse workforce, right? I think this is actually like one example in education policy where, we have a body of research, we have folks who are interested, people really see the need. I think you can sort of understand you can sort of understand it from a business case, why you need to be able to train, or sort of educate diverse kids and employ diverse teachers sort of in service of that. So I think this is a great area where, even though things are sort of challenging, I think at the national level, at least at the state level, there's lots of really cool, interesting work that's happening and people are sort of proceeding forward. So that makes me optimistic. In terms of my own work, there's a few projects that we have going on. So And two of them have actually been funded by the Institute for Education Sciences. So one, we're going to be looking at how all teachers are able to develop racial competency. So are they able to get knowledge from their peers? Where do they get knowledge from? How do they develop knowledge over time? And then how does that relate to school outcomes? And then the other project is actually a sort of that's actually much larger, where it's a broad set of folks from Penn and Columbia and a bunch of other places, where we're looking at how to develop and validate a culturally responsive leadership rubric. And so the idea there is to really develop, have a evidence-based rubric that we develop, and then sort of give folks the opportunity to use it, and then collect data around how that might relate to student outcomes. And so we think that's super important as people are trying to do equity, that they have really good tools that they could use, flying blind. And I think sometimes teachers and leaders can get in trouble if they just have to sort of grasp from thin air. But if we can give them really good tools to use, I think that's something that's super exciting. So those are two big projects that I have going on right now, amongst many other things. So.
Well, thanks, Dr. Lindsay, and we'll definitely look forward to those reports and sharing them when they come available. But really appreciate the conversation today. You're excellent insights, and listeners, please note that again, any reports or resources that we discussed today or related will definitely be attached to the webinar when released on our website and sent out to our governor's offices. So until next time, thanks for watching and listening, and have a great day.